Right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with John Walsh here in San Francisco at the American Geophysical Union Fall Meeting. My name's Marmion Grimes. I'm assisted by my off-camera co-host, Heather McFarland from IARC. And today we're going to be talking with Professor Walsh about changes in the Arctic, in Alaska. In particular, we just had a recent report come out from NOAA, the Arctic Report Card, and John, along with multiple other folks at UAF, were contributors to that report. John, what did the Arctic Report Card tell us about changes in the Arctic?
Well, it told us that the changes are continuing a pattern that's been ongoing for 5 or 10 years now, but if anything, some of the changes are accelerating. They're becoming more rapid, more dramatic. A couple of examples are sea ice in the Alaska region and some of the heat waves we experienced in Alaska. And in 2018, over in the northern European area, there were major heat waves that were discussed in the report card. Greenland went through an extreme summer melt season this past summer. So those are some of the features, some of the events that were highlighted. They're events that have been happening at a lesser level in the past, but when we get a string of these events years in a row consecutively, it means something is changing in the system.
So when you talk about warmer temperatures in the north, so it's not just one anomaly year. It's not just one year that people are talking about a warm winter or a warm summer, but we're actually seeing a pattern.
Right. The past 4 or 5 years have been the warmest 4 or 5 in the historical record for the Arctic, and that's a record of actual data that goes back over 100 years.
So that's not, sampling, core sampling, or anything like that. That's actually observed data.
Right. It's not a one-off event, which can happen occasionally. But when you get a string of events, that serves as a smoking gun in terms of climate change detection.
Right. Now you live in Alaska. I live in Alaska. People have been kind of just anecdotally talking about things feeling warmer, I think, for the last few years. Is that just people talking, or are we actually seeing it? Are we actually observing the change, do you think? Or
We are observing the change. Alaska's temperatures have been higher than ever before. But what's interesting is that the changes, the warmings, are more in the cold seasons, winter and somewhat less in spring and autumn. The summer temperatures, on average, have not changed as much.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a large increase in the winter temperatures. That's the season with the largest signal in the temperature record.
Yeah.
The number of extremely cold days has gone down dramatically in the last decade or two over Alaska, Canada, and even parts of Eurasia.
Does that affect shoulder seasons in the at all?
It does, especially with regard to snow cover. It means that the snows generally arrive later than they used to. In the last few years, snow has been 3 or 4 weeks late in establishing its main winter snowpack over Alaska, and it disappears earlier in the spring. So we're still getting snow, but it's a compressed snow season. That gives the bare ground a much longer period of exposure, and it lengthens the growing season as well.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe someday my watermelons will actually get ripe in my garden.
Well, it may be time to invest in farmland in parts of the Arctic.
Yeah, indeed. Do those changes in the winter temperatures, do they affect other things other than temperature? Do they affect precipitation or anything like that? Or is it too tough to tell that yet?
Well, the precipitation impact isn't that strong, but where we are seeing the impacts is on the sea ice. There's so much less sea ice especially in the Alaskan region.
Yeah.
The Bering Sea, for example, has had an unprecedented low extent, absence of sea ice in the last 2 winters. And a large factor there is the temperatures. The air temperatures are high. That affects the water temperatures. And then when you lose the ice, there's a feedback. The surface is darker during the summer so that the water can heat up even more. So there's a sort of a cascading chain of events there that's leading to the loss of sea ice, and air temperature is a key part of the reason.
I think I remember reading something about that having the ice out there all white, it will reflect some of the heat away, but if it's gone, that darker water absorbs the heat.
Right, and that's especially the case in the late spring and early summer months when there's a lot of incoming solar radiation. Wow. So the fact that we're way short of ice in April, May, and June lately has added to this feedback, as we call it.
Wow. So warm begets warm.
Right.
Wow. What does that do to like infrastructure in Alaska, or does that have an effect on things like the storms on the coast and the erosion and things like that?
It does have an effect on the erosion and flooding. The ice acts as a buffer or a lid on the ocean that keeps the waves down when storms come.
Yeah.
We're not noticing any major change in the intensity of the storms. There are some indications that storms are becoming a little more frequent, but the main factor in the increased flooding and erosion is the absence of ice in places like western Alaska, northern Alaska, and even over parts of the Siberian coast.
Yeah, I was talking to one of our researchers a couple of days ago here at the meeting, and he was talking about erosion near Nelson Lagoon, I believe. And the numbers were pretty incredible, just the amount of the land that was washing away.
Yeah, the USGS tracks these erosion rates, and in some places along the northern coast of Alaska, the rates are up in the 10 to 20 meters a year. That's 30 to 60 feet per year of land that they're losing.
Yeah, I suppose, in that case at Nelson Lagoon, there was infrastructure there, and so obviously if the land underneath the infrastructure washes away, you've got a big problem. Right. So it's not just environmental factors, infrastructure comes into play too. Heather, do we have any questions from Facebook? Okay, we did have a question from someone that was asking about whether or not the warming in the north would have any effect on enzoonotic and zoonotic diseases. This individual was Ty from the University of Alaska Anchorage. And so for folks online, I believe enzoonotic is diseases of animals, and then zoonotic is ones that can go from animals to people. Is that, I think that's correct.
But in both cases, these are tough things to track because when diseases spread, climate is not the only factor. Climate change is not the only reason. There are indications that some types of animals are migrating. Beavers, for example, are expanding their habitat.
I remember reading that.
That's happening on the northwestern part of Alaska. And to the extent that an animal population can carry a disease and changes its habitat, that would represent a change that could be driven, at least in part, by climate change. Another concern is ticks that can be carried by animals. There's a winter tick that can affect moose. There's a lot of concern that may be affected by warming temperatures in Alaska. But again, there are other factors at work there. And Kimberly Beckman at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game is doing a lot of work on that. So I'd suggest that you actually check with her to get the latest. We can say what's happening to some of the factors that drive animal populations and animal movements and perhaps survival rates of insects, but establishing the clear linkage there is something that I think the wildlife biologists are the best authorities on.
Yeah, it's kind of probably an area of research that we may see a lot more work in the coming years as the climate changes.
Right. And it is a big issue because subsistence hunting in Alaska is a major it's a major part of the lifestyle of most communities in Alaska. So it is something that needs to be watched and looked into.
It's an interesting sort of intersection of people think sometimes of different types of science as being sort of in their own lanes, but if you're talking about something like climate change, that can cause all sorts of ripple effects within animal communities and even in human communities too, when you're talking about subsistence foods and things like that.
Right. And there can be other factors that affect wildlife too, besides the diseases and the insects. One example that we have a fair degree of confidence in is the increase in freezing rain events, these so-called rain on snow events.
Yeah.
As the climate warms, especially in winter, which is what's happening, we're going to get more of these winter rains.
Yeah.
They create these ice layers on top of the snow or within the snow, and they persist through the winter. They have obvious implications for human activities,
sure,
for road traffic, but also for animals, for foraging animals. The animals are unable to access the grasses and the lichens, and I'm thinking here of reindeer herds and caribou.
So they just can't, they can't break through that ice layer easily.
Right. There have been several events that have actually been documented where thousands of reindeer or caribou have actually died as a result of these ice layers that have been created in the winter. And
wow.
the increase in these winter rain events is one of the more robust signals in the climate model simulations.
Wow.
So that's it's a wildlife element of climate change that I think we're going to increasingly need to reckon with.
Yeah, definitely. Do we have any questions from online?
Just a hello, but I have a question. So I have heard that there's some storm tracks are moving further north, and that has impacts in Alaska. Can you explain what that actually means?
Sure. Yeah, Heather's asked about the possibility of shifting storm tracks, especially in the Alaskan region. One thing we are seeing is signs of a northward shift of the storm tracks, at least in the Pacific part of the Arctic. In fact, it's more of a northwestward shift. Storms that were more frequent in the Gulf of Alaska and affecting southeast Alaska now seem to be more common in the Bering Sea. They move up along the west coast of Alaska and sometimes through Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea. So there's this northward shift, which means that communities in the western and northern parts of Alaska are being affected by storms more than in the past. There are also some suggestions that that's happening in the North Atlantic with storms affecting Svalbard and the area around Greenland, whereas storms used to track more often towards Europe. Now that northward shift of storm tracks is another feature of the climate model simulations that are driven by increasing greenhouse gases. In other words, it's one of the anthropogenic signals in climate change, a northward shift of the storm tracks.
And when you say storm tracks, what does that mean? Is that just the kind of exactly what it sounds like, the way the storms travel around the globe?
It's the most common paths for storms.
Gotcha. Okay.
And there is a main North Pacific storm track, which is along the Aleutians and perhaps into southeast Alaska, into the Gulf of Alaska. Then there's also one in the North Atlantic, which can either go from Iceland into northern Europe, or it can curve up into the Barents Sea region and affect Svalbard. And it's the shifts in those tracks that the climate models say we should expect to see over time. And there are some signs that that's happening already.
So how are they shifting, like north, or are they just shifting around?
It's mainly towards the north. There's a tendency to shift north and west. Wow. There was one very interesting example this year that came along even after the Arctic report card was released. It happened over Thanksgiving in western Alaska around Kotzebue. The sea ice was just starting to form. It's about a month late.
Right.
They were just starting to get this thin ice, this slushy new ice along the coast. And over Thanksgiving, a major storm came along up through the Bering Strait area. It stirred up the water around Kotzebue and essentially washed out the ice. Wow. So they had to start over again on forming their ice cover.
I wonder what that's going to look like as far as extent by the end of the season.
Yeah, a lot depends too on how much storm activity there is. And in fact, that storminess was one of the explanations for the last few years having so little ice. I mean, the water was warm to begin with, but when the ice did try to form earlier in 2018 and 2019, these storms came up along in the Bering Sea rather than farther east, and they essentially prevented the ice from expanding the way it might have in the past.
So we were talking about winter. Oh, do you have a question online? Oh, excellent.
So what would you say is the largest threat to the Fairbanks community interior? And this is coming in from Abigail.
Okay. I'd say there are a couple of main threats. One of them has to do with the thawing ground, the fact that the air temperatures are rising in winter especially means that the ground is becoming more vulnerable to thaw where it is frozen. And we're seeing examples of that in places like Goldstream Valley and some other areas. So I think thawing permafrost is one of the real risks we run into. And a second risk I see is increased fire activity in the summer season. As the summers become longer, even if they don't become warmer, if they just become longer, which they are, the chances of a dry spell, a period when lightning can start fires and the fires can spread, increases.
Yeah.
So I think the increased fire season severity is one of the things we have to watch out for. There are signs that's happening already. There have been a lot more severe fire years in the last 10 or 20 years than in the previous 10 or 20 years. And that, again, is a projection of climate models as well, that fire seasons in the boreal forest will become longer and more severe.
So we're seeing happen what the models said were going to happen.
Right.
Basically.
So there's another comment on here about the interest in working at the University of Alaska as a student and participating in climate research. Can you speak a little bit about opportunities to kind of participate at the student level in the kind of work that we do?
Sure. We have a number of students working today, in both undergraduate and graduate students.
Yeah.
The graduate students generally do thesis projects, master's thesis projects or PhD thesis projects, and they do their work in one of the research institutes. Our International Arctic Research Center is one of them. We do a lot of work on climate, the surface, the permafrost, sea ice, and that type of work. There's also the Institute of Arctic Biology. If students are interested in linking climate with some wildlife and biological activities, vegetation changes, for example. We have the Geophysical Institute, which does quite a bit of work in the climate-related areas. There is a Department of Atmospheric Science that has a graduate program. There's a Department of Wildlife Biology that does a lot of work in ecology. And if students have an interest in the engineering aspects, how engineering may be affected by climate and climate change, we have the Institute of Northern Engineering. So there are a number of institutes to work with. For undergraduates, we have a number of scientists who are actively working with undergraduates. They have projects that need undergraduate assistance, so they essentially pay salaries to students to do jobs related to the projects. I think that there's a wide range of time commitments there, but the faculty and the other research scientists are very open to students participating in the projects. We have in several departments, there's what they call Research Experience for Undergraduates, which is a program where students come usually in the summertime and they devote their whole summer full time to a project. So they really get immersed in the work that's going on, and in some cases that leads to graduate work later on. And then once they're exposed to the science, they're attracted to it and they follow up.
They're hooked. That curiosity is piqued, right?
Right.
And we have the availability of some grants for undergraduate students. I know we have an office that does some grants for undergraduate students. I've seen a few undergraduates actually here at AGU with posters, I think, a handful of them, but I know that undergrads and certainly multiple graduate students, I've talked to a few of them.
Right, and there's also an honors program that is growing rapidly. It's an undergraduate program for honors students, and that has adopted climate as one of its emphases. So they're really encouraging students to get into this honors program and do some work that's related to climate as part of their undergraduate program.
It's really nice in Fairbanks in particular, because at least in some of the disciplines, you can literally go out the back door of some of the research institutes and go find instrument sites and things like that are measuring things like permafrost. I think there's some seismic stuff back behind in North Campus too.
Right.
The natural lab is there.
Right, and we have access to various field stations beyond Fairbanks as well.
Yeah, Tulick Field Station is an
Right.
incredible resource.
Yeah,
they
that's
do
up
all
on the tundra. So
Yeah.
students get to experience a different environment
Yeah.
when they go up there.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
So apparently the honors program, according to this comment online, also offers a climate scholar program, which
Right.
sounds like a really cool track.
Wow.
Yeah, the Climate Scholars Program is fairly new, and that is one where climate has been one of the areas where they're trying to steer students. So I know that at IARC, our research institute, and several of the others, we would really welcome these climate scholars to work on projects, and I think it's a win-win situation. The students get exposed to the research that's going on, and the scientists get assistance with the projects that they're working on as well.
Yeah, there's something to be said for, there's a bit of a culture, I guess, in Alaska and at UAF. You know, when you live in a small town in the north, it's people are a little more accessible, I think, than
they are.
they might be in other places. And an undergrad student that's motivated could talk to somebody like you who has been, working for a long time, or any of our other scientists there at UAF, and say, hey, I'd love to work with you. And a lot of times that can happen.
Yeah, and we get those comments from our students as well. The fact that if they come from another university as undergraduates and do graduate work with us, they point out that there's a factor of 5 difference in the size, which does make it a much more personalized experience.
Yeah, definitely. Do we have questions from online at all?
Not at the moment.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, John, we were talking earlier about the winter temperatures in the north, but you were mentioning that Greenland, the ice sheet melted a great deal. Was that because of winter temperatures, or is that because of summer?
And that was actually because of summer temperatures. Greenland is so cold that it rarely gets up to the freezing temperature in winter, but in summer, various percentages of the ice sheet go above freezing and start to melt. This past summer, almost all the ice sheet, even up about 2 or 3,000 meters, that's 5,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level, reached the freezing temperature and experienced some melt. This year was I think the second greatest fraction of the ice sheet that experienced melt. There was one other year, a few years ago, that had a little greater fraction. But when that happens, the meltwater tends to run off. It can either go into the ocean, and that reduces the amount of water that's in the Greenland ice sheet, or it can trickle down to deeper levels. And there's some thinking that can actually lubricate the base of the ice sheet in some cases. But
so it might go.
Yeah, in either case, in either case, it's a loss for the ice sheet.
Yeah.
But this past year had the second greatest melt fraction record. That's 2019's summer.
Yeah.
Now that will freeze up in the wintertime, but then there'll be more melt next summer as well.
So is the Greenland ice sheet analogous to glaciers, or are those sort of two separate animals?
Well, they're two separate animals, but they're connected. The Greenland ice sheet is this one great blob of ice. It's just solid ice. It's 5,000 feet thick in the middle, and it covers almost all of Greenland. But most of the export of the ice, most of the flow of ice into the ocean occurs through what they call outlet glaciers. And those are valleys. Greenland does have mountains and valleys underneath the ice.
Yeah.
And there are valleys along the coast, much like we have in Alaska. And when the ice does flow towards the ocean, it actually flows preferentially through those valleys.
Right.
And they've been noticing that the flow rates and the loss of ice in these what they call outlet glaciers has increased over the last decade or two. So I'd think of Greenland as a big body of ice with these fingers or arms that reach out towards the ocean, and that's where the loss actually occurs.
Yeah, and are we seeing loss in Alaska glaciers as well?
Alaska glaciers are shrinking. There's a glaciology group in the Geophysical Institute that's been tracking the loss of ice in the Alaskan glaciers. And again, that's one of these accelerating time series where the rate of loss seems to be increasing over the last 10 or 20 years.
Wow, that's incredible. Heather, any questions from online?
Not yet, no.
Okay. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about the sea ice. We talked about the erosion on the coast. What about there are animals that depend on sea ice, and then people that depend on those animals. What happens when the sea ice extent is not as wide or broad or whatever the correct term is?
Yeah, there are repercussions above the surface and below the surface. Above the surface, I think the key is that the platform that some types of marine mammals use sea ice for is no longer there. And a great example would be walrus. Walrus use sea ice as a platform in order to make their dives down to the bottom, where the seafloor, where they pick up clams and other types of bottom food.
Right.
When the ice moves farther offshore, it moves out beyond the shallow ocean, beyond what they call the shelf seas that are only 100 or 200 meters deep. And then they're into deep water, and the water's too deep for dives. So the walrus can no longer make use of the sea ice as a platform for diving. Their only alternative is to come on shore in that case. And we've seen what they call walrus haul-outs become increasingly frequent. And in those cases, you get literally thousands of walruses packing the coastline. There are pictures available online if you do a search, and it is literally wall-to-wall walrus along the coastline in those cases. And that can be difficult for mothers who are nursing. It can lead to stampedes in some cases. So it's not the environment walrus are intended to be experiencing in the warm season. There are some types of seals that use sea ice for platforms for nursing, and they make use of the snow on top of the sea ice. When the sea ice goes out way early, they're losing that resource for nursing their young. So I think the marine mammals are feeling it, and the whales are another example of marine mammals that are impacted. Whales migrate largely along the ice edge, and we've had experiences in the last year or two, especially this past summer, where the edge is so far offshore that the whale's migration route is farther offshore than it used to be, and that has in turn impacted the subsistence whaling activity. The Barrow community this year had to wait several months to catch one whale during the fall harvest, and they only caught one whale, which is
because they're just too far out for their boats to get to.
Yeah, they're way offshore, exactly.
Wow.
So that's another impact. But those are direct marine mammal impacts. I think the perhaps a more concerning impact is what's happening to the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem below the surface.
Right.
When the ice forms in the wintertime, it rejects salt, and that water sinks to the bottom, and it's cold water. It's at the freezing temperature because that's what the ice is forming at. And that forms what's called a cold pool at the bottom of a region like the Bering Sea.
Yeah.
And that cold pool has historically been a barrier to fish migrations to the north. So the fish of the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska have not gone through Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea.
Right.
In the last 2 years, there's been so little sea ice forming in the Bering Sea that cold pool has essentially disappeared. There's just been a small remnant of it along the coast. So that barrier to the northward migration of fish is gone. And that means that some species of fish are showing up farther north than they'd been observed before. Nome, for example, has caught a certain species of Arctic cod that they had not in past years. There's a lot of concern now that the entire ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, could be disrupted because the migration patterns will be changed from what they've historically been. And that's something that was highlighted in the Arctic report card this year.
Interesting. So it's not just, we talked earlier about terrestrial animals, that the possibility that climate change could alter sort of where they go and where they are. For example, with the beaver. That also could apply to marine animals as well, obviously with the whales and then these species perhaps encroaching further north.
Right.
And that may not sound like a big deal, but these ecosystems, if they've been separate, probably mixing them
Right.
could cause who knows what.
Yeah, and then could conceivably affect commercial fishing down the road.
Right.
I mean, if fish change their regions where they're most common, the fisheries will need to adapt.
Wow.
So I have a question. I've heard that people are really concerned about ocean acidification in a lot of the world's oceans, and I'm just wondering if that's being impacted by climate change and if we're seeing that in the Arctic oceans as well.
Yeah, and that's another one. The ocean acidification is another one of the more robust features of the climate model projections, especially when they couple ocean models and ice models.
Yeah.
There have been some parts of the Arctic where more acidic water has been detected. In other words, a trend towards greater acidity. Some of the Canadian seas, for example, have become more acidic. In Alaska, the records are actually quite short for
Right.
the pH, which is a measure of ocean acidity. We don't have what I'd call a smoking gun because we don't have the long, consistent records to say that the waters are more acidic
Right.
than they have been in the past. But there are suggestions that some of the acidity metrics are increasing. There's a Kachemak Bay record that is starting to suggest increasing acidity, and there's certainly monitoring going on now. The entire Gulf of Alaska is being monitored by some of the ships. The ferries, for example, are actually contributing to the monitoring.
They have monitors on the ferries.
They take samples that are then analyzed for pH so that in another decade or so, we're going to have the long record it takes to document just what is happening to the acidity of the water. But that is, together with the migration risk, that's one of the main threats of of climate change in the marine part of the system.
I remember talking to I think Jeremy Mathis, who's I think with NOAA now, years ago about the pteropods, these little bitty creatures that the salmon eat. But acidification really can hit at the kind of the bottom of the food chain, right? The bottom of the food web, and then that just ripples.
Yeah, the increased acidity essentially dissolves shells.
Yeah.
So a lot of types of food for the higher trophics are potentially at risk.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody earlier this week, and she pointed out, people may not understand this when you say ocean acidification. It doesn't actually mean that the ocean is acid. It's just more acidic than it used to be.
Right.
That's something she wanted to make sure we clarified. Heather, you said we had another question come in?
So along the kind of ocean topic theme, are harmful algal blooms going to be more likely to increase as ocean temperatures increase?
Yes, that's a real risk, and it's one where we're already seeing the impacts of the warming water. I think Arctic-wide, there have been several studies that have shown that the blooms are increasing in frequency to a large sense because there's now a double bloom. There's so much open water that you get the normal spring bloom, but then also a later summer and early autumn bloom.
And what is an algal bloom? What does that mean?
It's a growth of algae. In some cases on the bottom of the ice, in other areas in open water. But the warmer water does favor the growth of the blooms and also the growth of some blooms that contain toxins. And these toxins are showing up in birds, they're showing up in various types of marine mammals. We just did a report on the changing environment in Alaska. Heather was the editor for that report, which has a nice diagram showing where the toxins have been detected in marine mammals and seabirds around Alaska over the last few years. And there have been a lot of reports of these algal blooms, or these toxins being detected.
So are they things where the animals are eating the algae and that's how they're getting toxins?
Yeah, the algae, the toxins in the algae work their way up the food chain, so they can end up in the marine mammals and the seabirds.
Right.
And that's another one of the risks that goes with the warmer water.
Yeah.
Some of these toxins have even been showing up in shellfish that have been consumed by people. There's a toxin that leads to what's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. There have been a couple cases of that in recent years. And those have been detected in years with the warmer water.
Yeah.
And,
so that paralytic shellfish poisoning is caused by an algae
Right,
as well?
right.
Okay, all right. And so probably people commonly sometimes call that red tide, right? Is that the same
in the
thing, or is it
southern
something?
regions, in mid-latitudes,
Yeah.
the red tide is an algal bloom, but I don't think that's been detected in the Alaskan waters.
Gotcha.
There
okay.
are some impressive satellite images of algal blooms in the Bering Sea, and the spring bloom can cover a large part of the Bering Sea.
Wow.
It shows up as a sort of a bluish-green tint that's not normally there when it does occur.
Wow, that's interesting.
So, is the blob back? And for those who don't know, can you explain what the blob is?
Sure, the blob is an interesting term.
That was an old movie, right?
Yeah. So when they say it's the blob back, I think they're not referring to the movie. I think they're referring to some unusually warm water temperatures that covered a large part of the North Pacific Ocean back in 2014 through 2016.
Yeah.
The entire Gulf of Alaska and even farther south, down towards the Pacific Northwest, was much warmer than it used to be by 2 or 3 degrees C, which is 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. There were some record warm temperatures there, and it was such a big area of warm water that it was referred to as the blob, just this blob of warm water. It tended to fade away in, say, 2017 and 18, but just in the last year or so, we've seen a pattern of ocean temperatures that looks a lot like what we had 5 years ago.
Wow.
And it's very reminiscent of the blob.
Wow.
The waters in the Alaskan region, the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska, are as warm as they were 5 years ago, even warmer in some places. I was just at a conference a couple weeks ago where some oceanographers pointed out that along the west coast of the U.S., California and up towards Oregon, there seems to have been a sort of a retreat from the blob conditions just in the last month or two.
Oh,
but that's along a fairly narrow strip, 100 or 200 miles along the coast. There's still a lot of warm water farther offshore. So I think that the key question will be whether the blob, this warm water at the surface, does survive the winter season when the storms tend to mix out the water.
Right.
Back in the true blob years, 2014 through 16, the blob did survive the storm season.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it fares this year, but at least it has a fighting chance of being back beyond just a few months.
What does it do to things in the ocean when there is this blob of warm water?
Well, the thinking is it contributes to the weather variations.
Oh.
It's essentially a source of heat for the atmosphere. So the atmosphere can be heated in ways that it did not used to be, and that could be a factor contributing to the warm winters in Alaska. When the blob was at full strength back in 2015 and 16, we had a record warm winter in Alaska. And there were also some cold outbreaks in the eastern part of North America. This was a case where the jet stream was disrupted.
Because of the blob?
Well, they think the blob was a
Possibly.
contributing factor.
Wow.
So if it does persist, there could be impacts on the atmosphere, and there could be impacts on the marine ecosystem as well if it persists for a few years.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. So you mentioned earlier this publication. We actually have it here. This is something that people can get online as well, correct? And this was done, this is Alaska specific, right? That was done up at IARC?
Right, yeah, it's called Alaska's Changing Environment.
Let's see it online.
And it's a report that Rick Tolman and I were the editors on, or the authors on. Heather McFarland here was the editor who did a lot of the layout, and the verbiage that's in there was from Heather for the most part, but it's an attempt to document the changes that we've observed, not that we're expecting, but that we've observed, especially over the last 5 years in Alaska and the waters surrounding Alaska. So it's an attempt to show how the last 5 years or so are different from the longer term historical record.
Yeah.
And we really span the various parts of the system, where there's sections in there on the atmosphere, temperature and precipitation. There's sections in there on the ocean with sea ice. There's the section on the marine ecosystem impacts, including the toxins that have been detected in the marine mammals around the coast. There's a section in there on wildfires, glaciers, the wildlife, the migrating beavers. Yeah. There's even a section in there on the human responses, documenting what set of communities have developed adaptation plans in response to in response to the changing environment. So it's an attempt to lay out what is ongoing. We're considering a follow-up, looking at what might be on store in the future, but we tried to avoid speculation or even just mention of expected future changes here, because I think the evidence tells a fairly compelling story already.
Definitely.
The evidence is there, and Alaska's what they call the canary in the coal mine. So this was an opportunity to give the changes some wider exposure.
Yeah, and it's available online. Anyone can download it for free, and I've looked through it. It's, I'm not a scientist. It's very accessible to the average person to look at and get a sense of what some of the changes that are happening right here in Alaska. Not here, since we're in California, but certainly the changes in Alaska that are happening, right now.
Right.
And it's available for folks online.
I could just add, there's been some interest in doing versions of that document that are more targeted to specific communities or regions.
Yeah.
The Fairbanks area is one that's looked into the possibility of getting a more targeted assessment of what's going on just in the area around Fairbanks, and other parts of Alaska, northwest Borough, for example, has made some inquiries. So we may see follow-ons that are shorter but more focused on particular locations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up that sort of the human response adaptation, because I think that's a kind of a big important topic, because we're not we can't necessarily change at least the current conditions,
right.
But certainly we're living on this earth, and we're going to have to figure out a way to adapt to things changing. And in Alaska, because we're so far north and our average temperatures are so close to freezing, right? We see the change more extreme.
Right, we're the test ground for some types of adaptation.
Yeah, definitely. Heather, you said we just have a few more minutes left, yes? Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you feel like people really need to know, or that you'd really like to highlight, either about the Arctic Report Card or this publication in particular?
Well, one aspect of climate change that's mentioned in both, without a lot of detail, is the change in extreme events. When climate changes, most people think of just the averages. They think of the average temperature changing by a few degrees, or the average precipitation changing by 20 or 30%, which is what we do expect to happen. But the real impacts come from the extreme events, the hot spells, the decrease in cold spells, the heavy rain events, the rain on snow events, the freezing rain events.
Yeah.
And those are, I think, what we need to pay more attention to as climate changes. We could even make the case that these extreme years we've been experiencing could be looked at as extreme events. They'll become more common as we get into a changed climate, but the change we're going to experience is going to come in fits and bursts, these extreme events first, before we actually feel a change in the average. So I think that's something that I'd encourage those who are interested in climate change to give a little more attention to.
Yeah, okay, very good. One last chance at questions online, Heather?
There was a question about what are communities in Alaska doing about climate change, and I think that would also feed well into what can people do.
Right. The range of options for communities is somewhat limited depending on whether they can relocate. There are communities that need to relocate, but that's an expensive proposition.
Yeah.
You're talking tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, and so far only one community is relocating. That's the community of Newtok. The other options are what they call in-place actions. Coastal communities can actually put up barriers, breakwaters, so they can buffer the coast with these rock piles, linear rock piles, so to speak, as a sort of a stopgap measure to try and delay the impacts. But I think the other option is to plan ahead for potential changes in the frequency of floods, changing temperatures, changing access to subsistence resources. In a lot of cases, those changes are ones that are community specific. Each community is different.
Yeah.
But each community knows what it relies on. And if they know that the general type of changes that are going to be affecting the area, they can apply those changes to their own way of life, their own lifestyles, and plan accordingly. So I think the strategy there is to engage, for scientists and communities to engage each other.
Yeah.
They call it co-production of knowledge, and then the communities themselves take that knowledge they gain from that interaction and put it to use.
Yeah. And certainly publications like this, the Arctic Report Card, anything that sort of puts science out there is certainly a step in that direction.
Right. We can say changes are ahead, but again, the community-specific actions are the ones that are going to really matter.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, John. This has been really a great discussion. And we, like I said, we appreciate everyone joining us online. And we'll sign off now from San Francisco. Thanks, everybody.
So long.